Hello and welcome back. It is Vanessa talking to you about everything you need to know to heal your trauma. This is video 3 of our Trauma Boss, Everything You Need to Know to Heal Your Trauma course. And this is part 1 of talking about stage 2 of trauma healing. So we're going to talk about trauma and your brain. I'm going to share my screen. Here we are talking about mental health and well-being, trauma and your brain. So stage 2 is where we look at the way that your nervous system dysregulation impacts your thinking, right? And this is designed to be an interactive presentation in the sense that there's a workbook you can follow along with, and you can absolutely stop at any time and journal your way through this if you find that there's something that comes up that you want to look at or dive into. Welcome to do that. There's going to be a lot of information presented. There'll be some exercises that you can engage in and plenty of time for reflection. So I want to remind you that when we're talking about trauma and when we're talking about trauma healing, sometimes things can come up and we can get our heart opens and we get what's called backdraft, and maybe we get a little overwhelmed. So give yourself permission to step back if that's the case. We're going to be presenting a lot of information today, me, myself, and I. And so I just want to remind you to let the information that resonates be the information that you take in today. And if you need to revisit these presentations, you have them to revisit. There is a lot to know about healing, okay? So you're not expected to learn it all, and there's no test at the end. Here we are again. You're allowed to be a masterpiece and a work in progress simultaneously, right? Today, we're talking about the brain and well-being. We're going to talk about something called the negativity bias. We're going to examine the idea of reflective thinking, and we're going to talk about reactive thinking. And then in part 2 of talking about stage 2, we'll look at irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions and some ways to shift your thinking. So I want you to remind you with respect to trauma, right? When it comes to mental, emotional, and spiritual trauma, your perception is the one that matters. If you thought that something was shocking and upsetting, then it was. So I also want to remind you, you are the secret to solving the mystery, right? We want you to find your way. And that's what this presentation is geared towards, is helping you find your unique path to healing. So remember, we talked about homeostasis and the idea that we gravitate towards wellness, that when we have balance, our body is actually meant to be in that state of, healing, right? When we're at homeostasis, the way that we think is just easier. And I'll show you more about that as the presentation unfolds. So just remember, it's a fancy way of saying balanced, right? It's the optimal resting point for your nervous system. Regulating your nervous system restores balance, aka homeostasis. So again, we're going to look at these charts, right? We love charts in psychology. They're great. So we're talking about the idea of a window of tolerance or a range of resilience. Like, where do I function best? Okay. And so in this chart, it's in the green zone, right? And then you'll see up top, it's what's hyper aroused. And that's that anxious response. Okay. You can't think clear. You're hyper vigilant. You're having intrusive imagery, flashbacks, maybe nightmares. In the moment, you can get tense and be rapidly breathing. So all of those things are possible. And then we have, regulation strategies bring us back into that range of resilience, the window of tolerance. Okay. So down at the bottom is this idea of hypo-aroused, and that's kind of like that depressed blah feeling where you're disengaged, maybe numb, maybe your heart rate is low, maybe you can't quite track things, maybe you're not able to move physically as much as you might want to. So that is often what's going on for depression. It's actually your nervous system is in this state of hypoarousal, downregulation. So We talked in the first presentation a lot um, about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. So remember that sympathetic stress, parasympathetic peace, fight, flight, freeze, rest, restore, relax. Okay. And so this is an image that I'll draw in my office for clients often, right? And so I want you to imagine that your nervous system can be like a pendulum, right? And so it's meant to do this delicate dance all day long, kind of between your parasympathetic, sympathetic. But what happens is we get outside of our range of tolerance. But even worse than that is when we're habitually dysregulated, like when we're 70% of the time stressed out, we get stuck over here in that sympathetic response. And now maybe 70 or 80% of the time, our sympathetic nervous system's engaged, and that only leaves maybe 30% of the time for our parasympathetic nervous system to engage. And so now that parasympathetic nervous system can't restore, relax, rest, and do those things that it needs to do for your body, right? So the other thing that'll happen is when you're in a prolonged sympathetic nervous system response, right? Your stress levels get really high. And then your body will say, well, I guess I don't really care. Your body's like, well, doesn't care if you're happy. It just cares if you're alive. And so if you're just 70% sympathetic engaged all the time, you can't restore your organs. You can't maintain that over time. So your body will go from anxiety to depression and it'll flick you over into depression. And that's where your parasympathetic nervous system literally has to take over because it's trying to restore balance. That's how homeostasis works. Your body strives for it. And when you don't provide it, it will take over, right? And then in the worst case scenarios, it's like anxiety, depression, then suicidal ideation, right? Because you're anxious, 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 then you get depressed. And then when you're depressed, you isolate and you're alone. And then that leads, we have a social engagement nervous system. The more alone you are, the more lonely you feel, the less important and seen and valued you feel, the more you feel like you don't belong. And that's where the suicidal ideation kicks in. So this is all really important stuff. What we're talking about here, right? For those habituated to high levels of internal stress since early childhood, it's the absence of stress that creates unease, evoking boredom and a sense of meaninglessness. People may become addicted to their own stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Hans Sale observed, to such persons, stress feels desirable, while the absence of it feels like something to be avoided, right? So you get habituated to high levels of stress, and it's like addiction. And then when your body doesn't have it, it doesn't know what to do. So consider your own window of tolerance or your own range of resilience. Is hyperarousal, do you get up? Is hypoarousal, can you relate to the idea that you were anxious for too long and then you got depressed? Right? When overwhelm sets in, right? Living in a state of overwhelm can actually be a sign of that habitually dysregulated nervous system, right? So you're overwhelmed, right? No time, tired, bills, headaches, worry, fear, anxiety, all that. I mean, it's real, right? And with the pandemic, man, it's been hard. So what happens is stress stimulates the production of cortisol. And what does cortisol do to the body? All kinds of things, right? Cortisol is produced when your stress levels are high, and then it can impact your arthritis, decrease your immune system function, decrease your metabolism. It can lead to depression, hypertension, chronic fatigue, sleep deprivation, obesity, tunnel vision, acid reflux, hostility, right? All of those things. And you might recall some of those things are the result of also nervous system dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. And then you think about it, nervous system dysregulation impacts my physical health. Remember, I said that, right? And this is why. Okay. So cortisol is the stress hormone, right? And it can also lead, they say, to fat around the middle, but we don't really know if that's true. So when you're too much stress, right? You can wake up exhausted, you're over emotional, you can get colds a lot because your immune system is low. Poor sleep, right? Remember, overwhelmed, all that stuff. So this is where your endocrine system interacts with your nervous system. And when this cortisol is produced, because your nervous system is all fired up, you're in trouble, my friend. You're in trouble, right? So a regulated nervous system, right, naturally produces the hormones needed for happiness and motivation. Oh, newsflash, right? So there's actually happy brain chemicals, other, right? The cortisol, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin. You can rewire yourself to turn these on in new ways, right? And that's what our focus is when we talk about stage 3 healing, which is in future presentations. Right now, we're at stage 2 healing, where we're looking at how the brain and the thinking are impacted by the dysregulation. So there's easy stress reduction techniques we're all probably familiar with, right? Oh, my necklace just fell. Listening to music, right? A warm cup of tea, gardening, maybe your pets, right? You're laughing, you're deep breathing, maybe you have a massage scheduled, but high cortisol can interfere with these usual stress reduction techniques actually working. So you can try all those things, but they're not working. And that, again, can be a sign of that habitually dysregulated nervous system. So at that point, that's where you want to focus on growing your other regulation strategies, the breathing runs, the containment strategies, right? The 5 sense regulation strategies, and that can help to overcome and to balance your nervous system so that your other stress reduction techniques actually work again, okay? So this is the part where I want to just slow it down, right? And we're going to talk about this social nervous system, okay? We are actually wired for connection with others, right? So having a strong desire for connection is normal and necessary for our well-being. We are hardwired to seek proximity and closeness with others. Voicing this desire and initiating behaviors of closeness are signs of health and sanity, not signs of dependency or neediness, right? Valuing emotional connection is actually a beautiful thing. So some of us get traumatized by relationships, and then we start to feel that closeness isn't worth it. So something to consider, okay? Childhood trauma interrupts the natural development of this social engagement nervous system, right? Relationships become unsafe when we experience trauma, and relationships are also very important for our well-being. Right? So, like I said, there's moments where this might land deep. So the adult who struggles to trust themselves is often the child who had their truth habitually invalidated or denied. Trusting ourselves and others. Oh my goodness, right? Relationships become difficult when we have relational or intergenerational trauma patterns. We talked about that in stage 1 presentations, part 1 and 2. So treading lightly, right? When we don't trust the emotional regulation of another, there's a tendency to do some of the regulation for them in our preparation. This is different than considering a polite, kind, or direct approach. Doing their regulation for them often means we shrink what we're saying, we use language where we tiptoe around, and we find greater concern in managing how they respond rather than honoring what we are expressing and what we need to express, okay? So this is a stress-inducing way to live. And remember what I said, if we don't learn to co-regulate, we struggle to self-regulate. So if you struggle to self-regulate, it's probably a cue that you didn't learn, right, to self-regulate. If you need to co-regulate, be kind to yourself. You can absolutely teach yourself to self-regulate. But if co-regulation is your go-to, again, that can often be a sign, right, of trauma, right? So being authentic is the key. Stop breaking yourself into bite-sized pieces for someone. Stay whole and let them choke. Anyway, I think that's pretty cute, the nap. I like cookies too. So anyway, trusting others, right, is the key to being authentic. Authenticity and attachment are necessary for our well-being. In other words, being seen and valued for who you are, right? making a contribution with the beautiful skills and tools and offerings that you have in this lifetime. This is very important to our overall sense of contribution and well-being. So consider the impact of living in overwhelm, okay? And maybe take a moment to journal. And that was short and sweet. So stage 2, part 2 will be in the next video, and I will see you there.